I never expected that having my future mother-in-law living with us would turn my entire life upside down. I'll call her Kathy for simplicity. Kathy had nowhere else to go after she lost her job, or so my fiancé claimed when he asked me to open our apartment to her. We were a young couple on a tight budget, but I loved him enough to make the sacrifice. I worked full-time as a project coordinator, paying half the rent plus most of the bills, or so my fiancé thought. In reality, I was covering much more than he realized because I'd gotten a recent raise I never told him about. Instead of using that money for myself, I kept the household afloat whenever finances got shaky. This wasn't entirely altruistic. I wanted to ensure that we had a comfortable life, that we didn't fall behind on bills, and that we could start saving for a wedding someday. So, I quietly made up the shortfall every month. When Kathy moved in, I naively believed she'd be grateful for the chance to stay rent-free. Instead, she treated me like I was an intruder in my own home, and that was just the beginning of my problems. On her first day, Kathy criticized every inch of our apartment, from the color of the couch to the arrangement of the kitchen cabinets. She wore this disapproving scowl and mumbled under her breath about how I was spoiling her son, how I'd turned him into a doormat. At dinner, she eyed the meal I'd prepared and said it was too bland, that her son deserved better. When I tried to explain I was following a recipe he actually liked, she brushed me off with a sneer and changed the subject to how I'd never be a good wife. My fiancé, Ethan, just sat there, uncomfortably picking at his plate. Later, he told me to ignore her. He said she was under stress from losing her job. He promised it was temporary, but even a few weeks under these conditions felt like torture. Every morning, she'd wake up and immediately start barking orders at me. She'd never ask politely for coffee or breakfast. It was always a command, and if I dared to push back, she'd launch into a tirade about how I wasn't raised right. It got to the point where I'd avoid the common areas of my own home just to keep the peace. I was nearly defeated. I thought maybe Kathy would appreciate my help once she realized I was the one covering most of the rent. But she never bothered to ask how the finances worked. One night, Ethan casually mentioned we were a bit short on groceries, and I offered to pick up the tab. Kathy snapped that I was trying to buy their affection. The irony was painful, given I was already paying the bulk of our living expenses. If she was in a good mood, rare as that was, she might ignore me completely. If she was angry, she mocked my appearance, questioned my intelligence, and complained about how I was leading her beloved son astray by making him live in an apartment instead of a proper house. By week 3, I was unraveling. My anxiety spiked, my appetite dropped, and my work performance suffered because I dreaded coming home. I tried to talk to Ethan about setting boundaries. He said he agreed, but he never followed through. He let her boss him around too. He insisted it was temporary, that she'd move out once she found a job. But every day, I'd see her in pajamas, scrolling aimlessly through her phone, showing zero interest in job applications. Something had to give. I was done. One Friday night, Kathy crossed a line she couldn't uncross. I had just gotten home from a brutal day at work and found her rummaging through my personal desk drawer. I asked what she was doing, and she snapped that she was looking for some important documents Ethan needed. When I asked why she was searching my private space, she rolled her eyes and said, "This is my son's apartment, so everything here is his, including that desk." She even had the nerve to wave some of my paperwork in front of me, mocking my sticky notes and to-do lists. I felt a burning anger swell in my chest. I'd never confronted her aggressively before, but this time I demanded she put my things down. She laughed and called me a control freak. That moment, I decided enough was enough. I'd spent weeks letting her get away with tormenting me in my own home. My face felt hot, my hands shook, but I held firm and told her never to touch my belongings without permission again. She hurled another insult, but I didn't even register it fully. My mind was already racing, thinking about an exit plan. I refused to keep living like this. Later that evening, I pulled Ethan aside. I told him I was done living with his mother. I didn't issue an ultimatum, but made it clear I couldn't handle the stress any longer. He sighed and said he understood, but then asked if we could wait longer until she found a job. That was the final straw. It felt like he was choosing her comfort over my mental health. I told him I'd started looking for my own place. I expected him to protest, but he just looked tired. He asked me not to do anything rash. He claimed we could find a compromise. I knew there was no middle ground because Kathy didn't see me as an equal occupant. She saw me as an obstacle. Later, in bed, he tried to convince me that once she was working again, she'd contribute to rent and we'd get a bigger place. But I'd lost faith in her ever stepping up. She was content to live off our efforts while belittling me. By the time I fell asleep, I'd decided I was done with both of them if he couldn't grow a spine. I had enough in savings to secure a small place of my own, and I planned to do that. I spent the weekend hunting for apartments. I visited a few that were within my budget and found a cozy one-bedroom in a decent neighborhood. On Sunday evening, I sat down with Ethan again. I told him I was moving out, at least temporarily. He looked distraught, but I reminded him he'd done nothing to stop his mother's behavior. I offered him the chance to come with me, but I insisted Kathy was not welcome. If he wanted to keep supporting his mother, he could stay in our current place, but I was no longer paying the bulk of the rent. This was news to him. He had no idea I'd been footing so much of the bill. He looked stunned. I explained that I had a recent raise and had been covering extra rent and utilities for months. His face went pale and he started to protest, but I cut him off. I told him this arrangement was no longer sustainable. I needed respect and peace of mind. He asked if we could work something out with Kathy, maybe get her to pay her share, but after the way she treated me, I refused. The time for negotiation was over. I'd already signed the new lease. My decision was final. I started packing my belongings discreetly. Kathy noticed and confronted me in the hallway. She demanded to know why I was abandoning her son. I told her I wasn't abandoning him, I was escaping her. She scoffed, said I was ungrateful, and spewed more insults. I didn't bother arguing. She ranted about how I was mooching off Ethan. That was laughable, considering she paid zero rent. I told her I was moving out and taking my financial contribution with me, so if she wanted a roof over her head, she'd better start job hunting. She froze, blinked, and asked what I meant by financial contribution. She claimed Ethan was paying all the bills. I laughed in disbelief. Apparently, Ethan had never told her that I paid more than half the rent and most of the utilities. I let the truth slip, perhaps more harshly than intended. I spelled out exactly how much I'd been paying each month. Her face went red, then drained of color. She stuttered that I couldn't just leave like that. She tried to backtrack, saying we could all talk it out. It was so transparent. She only cared now because she needed the money. I walked away, feeling oddly empowered for the first time in ages. Moving day arrived. I'd hired a friend with a van to help transport my boxes. Kathy hovered around like a wasp, flinging passive-aggressive comments about how I was ruining Ethan's life. Ethan stood by looking miserable, occasionally trying to help, but mostly just wringing his hands. Once everything was loaded, I turned to give him a final chance. I told him he could come with me if he was ready to stand up to his mother. He glanced at her, then shook his head. I could see the conflict on his face, but he still wouldn't choose me, so I left. The drive to my new place felt surreal. Part of me was heartbroken, but another part felt a weight lift off my shoulders. My friend tried to cheer me up by talking about how new beginnings can be scary but also liberating. We unpacked boxes in silence for a while, and I took a moment to appreciate that this was my space. No one could barge in, no one could rummage through my things, and no one would insult me under my own roof. I slept on a bare mattress that night, surrounded by unpacked boxes, but it was the most peaceful sleep I'd had in weeks. Absolutely blissful. A week passed with no word from Ethan. Then one evening, my phone buzzed. It was Kathy. I let it go to voicemail. She left a long, rambling message about how Ethan was struggling to afford rent, how bills were piling up, and how it was my duty to come back. I deleted it without responding. 15 minutes later, Ethan called. This time, I picked up. He sounded drained. He said he missed me, that things had gone from bad to worse. The landlord was threatening eviction since they were behind on payments. I listened quietly. He asked me to move back in, just until we get everything sorted. I told him I wasn't interested in bailing them out. He pleaded, saying his mom was a wreck and had even started applying for jobs out of desperation. I felt a small, grim satisfaction. This was the consequence of their choices. He finally admitted he knew he should have stood up for me. I told him that his realization came too late. I wasn't coming back. If he wanted, He could stay with me as long as he left Kathy behind. There was a long pause. Then he asked me to consider the fact that she was his mother. I said no. After that call, my resolve hardened. I wasn't cold-hearted, but I couldn't reward their blatant disrespect. Days turned into weeks, and I was settling into my new place well. I reconnected with friends I'd neglected, took on extra projects at work, and even enrolled in some online courses to advance my career. My nights were calm, my mornings drama-free. Then, out of the blue, Kathy showed up at my new apartment building. She must have gotten the address from Ethan. She banged on my door until I answered, glaring at me with tears in her eyes. She begged me to come back, said she couldn't stand seeing her son suffer. I told her that this was the life she orchestrated. If she'd treated me with a shred of respect, maybe I would have stuck around. She tried to guilt-trip me, saying I was tearing a family apart. I calmly told her that a family supports one another, not tear each other down. She sniffled and asked if I'd at least lend them some money until she found a job. The gall of this woman was unreal. I refused. She screamed that I was selfish, that Ethan deserved better. I closed the door in her face without another word. I felt nothing. A few weeks later, I heard through a mutual friend that Ethan and Kathy had been evicted. They apparently had to move into a dingy motel on the outskirts of town. Part of me felt pity for Ethan, but not enough to make me forget all the times he failed to defend me. I suppose you could call that moment my revenge. Seeing the very people who made my life miserable have to face the consequences of their own actions. But it didn't feel as triumphant as one might expect. Mostly, I felt relief that it wasn't my problem anymore. I kept focusing on myself. I landed a promotion at work, thanks to the online courses I'd taken. My savings were growing again now that I wasn't bankrolling two other adults. Life was good, and I was proud of myself for cutting out toxic influences. One evening, I got a text from Ethan. He said he was sorry, that he realized he'd chosen wrong. He told me he still loved me. He wanted me to give him another chance. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I typed a single sentence. You chose your path, and I chose mine. I blocked his number and never looked back. In the aftermath, I did sometimes question whether I'd been too harsh. But every time I remembered Kathy's insults and Ethan's silence, I knew I'd made the right choice. I wasn't the villain in this story. I was a person pushed to her limits. I'd given them every chance to treat me with basic human decency. In the end, they'd reaped what they sowed. My own life continued to improve. With the drama behind me, I could invest in things that brought me joy. I decorated my new apartment the way I liked, spent time with people who valued me, and learned new skills. My nightmares about Kathy's voice faded, my confidence grew. A few months later, I heard that Kathy had finally landed a part-time job. Ethan supposedly picked up a second job to help them transition out of the motel. They were making it, barely. I got occasional messages from mutual friends hinting that Ethan missed me, that Kathy still blamed me for everything. I never responded. The best revenge was my success and happiness, free from their toxicity. I'd already exacted my retribution by letting them deal with the reality of living without my financial support. I had no intention of going back. I was completely done. Not long after, I started dating someone else. He treated me with kindness, respect, and genuine affection, everything I'd lacked before. I realized how badly I'd been missing out by staying with someone who wouldn't defend me against his own mother. My ex-future in-laws became a distant memory. Occasionally, I'd get curious and snoop on social media to see if Kathy still posted her self-righteous rants. She did, mostly about how ungrateful people were. I saw photos of Ethan looking haggard, older than his years. I felt a pang of sympathy, but I had no intention of reaching out. My life was so much better without their drama. As for the money they owed me, because honestly, I spent thousands more than my fair share, it was a sunk cost. I had no desire to chase them down, and it was unlikely they'd ever pay me back. Let them deal with their own mess. The satisfaction of walking away with my head held high was worth far more than any check they could write. I was free. Free from the daily insults, the manipulation, and the guilt trips. And I was thriving. That, I believe, is the sweetest form of revenge I could ever have asked for. I will never regret leaving them. Sometimes I still reflect on the day Kathy dug through my desk and how that single violation sparked my decision. If she hadn't been so brazen, I might have continued tolerating her treatment. slowly losing myself in the process. I'm grateful in a twisted way because it forced me to find my own strength. I learned that enabling people's bad behavior only prolongs the inevitable confrontation. It was painful to walk away from someone I once envisioned a future with, but it would have been more painful to stay in a home where I was neither respected nor valued. When people ask about my past, I don't mince words. I allowed myself to be treated poorly, but I reclaimed my dignity and set boundaries. Kathy thought I was weak. Ethan mistakenly assumed I would always support him, no matter how poorly his mother treated me. They both learned otherwise. Now, I'm engaged to my new partner. He's met my family, and they adore him. We plan a small wedding without drama. I have the life I deserve. And if there's any takeaway from this ordeal, it's that you don't have to forgive people who betray you. Sometimes, the best closure is moving on and never letting them back in. I won. I don't regret a single step. My story isn't about hope for reconciliation. It's about standing firm against those who exploit your kindness. Some might see it as harsh, but I see it as justified. In the end, I got my peace, my revenge, and my freedom. I stood up for myself and never looked back. That's victory enough, forever.